Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back. Like was just said, my name is Brian Sylvester. I'm a special counsel at Covington and Burling. Covington is an international law firm based in Washington. We have an extensive food, drug, and device practice, and we're excited to be here today to talk about some key updates in the cultured meat world.
Yeah, I'm Jessica O'Connell. Is this on? Is mine? Okay, I'm Jessica O'Connell. I'm a partner based in DC as well in the Food and Drug Group at Covington, and yeah, very excited to be here. I think we have a somewhat brief presentation, then excited to take questions as well.
Great. Clicker. So, since I've been working in this field over the past couple of years, the questions have evolved regarding the regulatory conversation. We started off back in 2018 figuring out which agency would actually take the lead, because in the United States we have the FDA and the USDA, and the jurisdiction wasn't all that clear. And as the regulatory conversation has evolved really rapidly over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of firsts. We saw in December of last year, the Singapore Food Agency approved for the first time a cell-cultured product. And in the US, we saw a lot of activity actually over the past 2 to 3 years where the FDA and the USDA have developed interagency working groups. And there's a new rule that's being proposed by the USDA on labeling. And we're excited to talk all about that. Also interesting for us is that consumers have really become interested in these different alternative protein options, and cultured meat is definitely a strong contender among the different alternative protein options. And so a lot of the questions that we've navigated over the years for plant-based foods apply here to cell-cultured foods as well. And so we'll talk about some of those key considerations from a regulatory standpoint that we should be considering. Another big update was that the USDA just made its first investment in cell-cultured meat, which is great news for the industry. So for today's agenda, just to level set so that everyone understands what we're covering, we're going to first talk about the regulatory framework that exists in the United States for food and how that applies. We have to lay that groundwork so that we can understand what the different laws that apply to cell-cultured meat and alternative proteins generally. We'll talk about the MOU, which many of you would be familiar with, between the FDA and USDA when it comes to cell-cultured meat technology. We'll talk about key considerations, labeling developments, and naming conventions and litigation around labeling.
So and really some of this is very basic. I think a lot of you might be familiar with already, but we really did want to level set for the discussion across the board. Just very high level, kind of thinking about the jurisdictional overlap between FDA and USDA. And so from a legal perspective, from a statutory perspective, FDA has jurisdiction over all food. And so that food includes meat, it includes animals that will produce food or become food. And it's a very broad jurisdiction. In certain aspects of that, FDA and USDA have joint jurisdiction, and FDA will defer to USDA. And so where the overlap comes in the cultured space is really thinking about those products where USDA has jurisdiction as well. And so that's meat and poultry products. That would include products that contain meat or poultry, and so typically the rule of thumb is 3% or less meat, 2% or less cooked. 3% or less raw, 2% or less cooked. And so products like pepperoni pizza, soups containing meat, sauces containing meat, things like that will also fall under USDA jurisdiction.
And to point out, we get a lot of questions about game meat, and so game meat is actually regulated by the FDA. And so it's a little confusing since USDA would regulate cows and so forth.
And then seafood, most is FDA except for catfish, which is USDA. So it's not a straightforward setup, unfortunately, and there's nuances across the board. So the governing FDA law kind of in this space is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and that is what gives FDA broad jurisdiction to regulate food. That's food labeling, that's food marketing, and food safety as well.
And for USDA, we have 3 key statutes: the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, and the Egg Products Inspection Act. So when it comes to cell-cultured meat and poultry, the first 2 statutes listed here would apply, and those are the statutes that the USDA has been focused on when it comes to the labeling requirements that we'll talk about a little bit later. So talking about these existing precedents and what the USDA and FDA actually regulate currently under existing law, we thought we would break these out as you see here on this slide. So USDA regulates meat and meat food products and poultry products under the 2 statutes we just talked about. USDA regulates establishments that slaughter, but importantly also establishments that process meat and poultry products. And so that's where USDA is deriving its jurisdiction to have inspectors present at facilities that are processing, where you harvest and process cultured meat products. So processing activities generally under USDA's framework include mixing, grinding, fabrication, patty formation, stuffing, mechanical tenderization, cooking, smoking, and so forth. And USDA, under their statutes, determines they're focused on safety, wholesomeness, and the accuracy of labeling.
And then, like I said, from an FDA perspective, the authority is very broad. And so we're starting from a broad and then kind of narrowing in. FDA does determine the safety of food ingredients, and so that includes ingredients that are used in meat or poultry products, seafood products as well. FDA has a lot of experience and expertise in assessing the safety of food products of biotechnology. And so we saw that with GE salmon, but others as well. And then just taking a step back, FDA is also an agency that regulates medical products and has a lot of expertise with cells and cell cultures and other spaces. And so that's where their expertise comes into play here as well.
And I think we forgot to mention that I'm a former USDA lawyer and Jessica is a former FDA lawyer. So that's why we divided up.
That's why we're going back and forth like this.
So we saw this really cool graphic that many of you have probably seen, and it just shows how the world of cultured meat has expanded over the past couple of years. It's from 2020. Now the map is much more filled, even more than this. And so, you know, we get a lot of questions about the U.S. regulatory framework, but at the same time, the EU is of interest. Different parts of Asia, Singapore obviously, Southeast Asia in particular is of interest to a lot of companies. And so we're keeping track of all these different developments with a focus on the United States, of course. So coming back to the US, we do have this MOU, and just to level set so that everyone understands where we stand in terms of regulatory oversight. This was released back in March of 2019. It outlines how the FDA and USDA work together to regulate production of cell-cultured foods produced from what we call cell lines derived from USDA amenable species, meaning like those types of animals that fall under USDA jurisdiction under the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act. So FDA, under this MOU, will exercise regulatory oversight up until the point of harvest from the bioreactor. And after that, if it's a meat or poultry product derived from cell culture technology, that's when USDA oversight begins. And so those facilities will need to obtain a federal grant of inspection, much like any other conventional meat processing facility would have to also obtain that federal grant of inspection. The key update that we keep referencing is that last month, on September 3rd, USDA published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, soliciting comments and information on labeling USDA-regulated cell-cultured foods. So those would be meat and poultry products. And so the USDA has not yet proposed rules, but they're trying to understand what the key concerns are. They want more information to determine what type of rules they need to actually roll out and propose.
And just one point of clarification, just broadly in the differences between meat and poultry products and other FDA-regulated products, USDA generally has pre-market oversight over labeling, and so they have the ability to approve labels for products that they regulate, whereas FDA does not typically review labels of products before they're launched. And so some of this in terms of USDA overseeing inspection and labeling and the comments on naming really relate to that pre-market ability to review those labels as well. So breaking down a bit more kind of the regulatory pathway, this really breaks it kind of vertically into the stages where FDA would have primary jurisdiction and then USDA. So some of this is repetitive of what Brian just said, but really thinking about how the division of labor is. And a lot of this goes to if you're thinking about coming to market and thinking about what regulators to engage with and when to engage with them and how to start the process, it's important just to think about who has the primary oversight and who you want to be talking to here. So on the pre-market side, we're thinking about what's going into the substances used in the manufacturing, what's going to the growth medium, what equipment you're using, how you are planning to grow and proliferate the cells. That's generally FDA's oversight. Anything related to how that manufacturing process might impact the materials they're using and whether that requires a new safety review or assessment, that's FDA. Considering whether and what components are already approved for use, food additives or GRAS, that would be FDA as well. And FDA has expressed a strong willingness to engage with companies early and regularly throughout this process. And so I think the one thing I would say, especially as a former FDA person, is don't be afraid to engage with FDA early. You don't need a very strong reason to go to them, and I think that group in particular at the agency has welcomed meetings, even if they're just very high level and informational, and so they're not going to hold it against you, and I really think if you're thinking about kind of if you have questions about your process, questions about kind of how to approach certain aspects of it, FDA is willing to have those conversations. The manufacturing process, again, will shift from FDA to USDA at some point. And so I'm going to turn to Brian now to talk about kind of the USDA string of things.
Right, so under the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act, USDA, as we discussed, has oversight. You have to have a federal grants of inspection that you have to apply for. And USDA expects that those facilities will have a hazard analysis plan in place. And so you want to make sure you understand all the potential hazards and that you have preventive controls in place to mitigate against those hazards from occurring. In addition to the manufacturing oversight over the processing facilities, USDA has oversight over labeling because of the pre-market review authority that USDA has. And so some of the questions that will need to be addressed would be product name. Does the product qualify as meat or poultry as it's defined in the regulations? Obviously, the way the laws were written did not contemplate meat or food products, meat or poultry products derived without slaughtering an animal. And so that's been part of the conversation. There's been petitions filed, and we'll talk about that in a second, by conventional meat interests, trying to parse the words so that cell-cultured meat products would have to have certain qualifiers. So back in October of 2020, FDA published a request for information pertaining to the labeling of foods comprised of or containing cultured seafood cells. A lot of the questions from that request for information are repeated or built upon in the USDA advance notice for proposed rulemaking that was issued last month. And so it's important to know that the USDA and FDA will be aligning on key principles when it comes to labeling these products. And we're looking forward to seeing the comments that are submitted to USDA and to see how the FDA and USDA will align. There's a working group that's interagency between the FDA and USDA that's focused on labeling. FDA, as Jessica mentioned, does not have pre-market authority when it comes to label reviews, and so that's why they don't necessarily have to do any rulemaking here, but USDA does have that pre-market authority, and so they are obligated here, in this case, in their view, to publish new rules. In terms of facility inspection, we just touched on that. It's not clear what a USDA inspection of a processing facility, cell-cultured meat processing facility, is going to look like. There's going to be a lot of education that's needed on the part of USDA getting up to speed on what this technology is all about and what the hazards are in order to best oversee the process to ensure that consumers are getting safe and wholesome products.
I mean, I think if you think about the traditional USDA oversight and the kinds of hazards they're used to looking for in a slaughterhouse or meat processing facility, it's very different than what this is. And so I think some of it, too, will be how specialized USDA inspectors will become and will need to become in order to work in this space. I think this is really just what we just covered, but I think the key point is that these agencies are working together, and there are a number of interagency working groups. We've seen there were some hiccups at the beginning in terms of asserting jurisdiction, but I think now what we're seeing is collaboration, and I think a recognition that both agencies do need to partner closely in order to move this process along. So we wanted to touch briefly on naming conventions, just because this is an issue that's been quite kind of quite notable, I guess, over the past few years. I think where it's been more kind of urgent has been in the plant-based space. And so we've seen a lot of plant-based companies engaging on the naming of their products at the state and federal level. But I will say a lot of that activity has been driven, quite frankly, by interest in how cultured meat products will be named as well. And so even though those products aren't on the market right now, what we see at a lot of the federal and state level are advocates bringing forth examples of cultured meat and kind of concerns about how those might be named. So in 2018, the Cattlemen's Association submitted a petition to FSIS, broadly kind of requesting limitations on how words like beef and meat can be used in food naming. There were a number of comments in response to this petition. A lot of comments opposed the petition, but still kind of got to this nuanced issue of whether there should be some qualifier that's required in the cultured meat space to identify cultured products versus those that are coming from slaughtered animals. USDA denied this petition in 2021, and so just recently, a few months ago. And what they said was they were denying it because they're going to address the issue. They don't need to do it how the cattlemen requested necessarily, but that issue is going to be addressed. They put out the ANPR that Brian mentioned a few minutes ago, and that they don't have jurisdiction over the naming of plant-based products. And so USDA doesn't have jurisdiction to conclude whether products like Impossible and Beyond Meat are mislabeled or not, because those are plant-based and under the jurisdiction of FDA. Go ahead.
Yep. So diving into the USDA rulemaking, what are the key questions that the USDA is asking? So it's important to know that USDA has a number of standards of identity for various meat and poultry products on the books. And so now USDA is considering developing new regulatory requirements for labeling cell-cultured meat products. So what is an example of a standard of identity? So here is a standard of identity straight from the regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations for hamburger. As you can see, it's pretty detailed. And rather than me reading through it, you can take a look. But the question to consider here is whether or not this standard of identity only contemplates the use of beef derived from a slaughtered animal or not. And so those are the kind of questions that the agency is seeking to get at. So on the next slide, we lay out a bunch of questions that we extracted from that ANPR, the Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So, for example, should USDA require that product name of cell-cultured products inform consumers that the product was made using animal cell culture technology? If so, what terms should be used to convey this information? Cultured, cell-cultured, cultivated, clean, et cetera. How should USDA regulate the labeling of products comprised of both cell-cultured meat and non-cell-cultured meat? Should USDA be establishing new standards of identity for hamburgers and pork loins and hot dogs that are derived from cell culture technology? And are cell-cultured products likely to use label claims for which USDA should develop new regulations or guidance? Something that I should make clear is that when you have certain claims that are considered special statements and claims on products like natural, and the like, those kinds of claims need to be reviewed by USDA through that pre-market review process that we were talking about. And so this is what that final question is sort of getting at. Are these types of products likely to make certain categories of special claims that would also require USDA to pay special attention to in this space?
And I think for, I don't know if there are many lawyers out there, if any at all, or First Amendment kind of junkies, but I think taking a step back, what's really interesting here is the question of what the government has the authority to require to be disclosed in labeling versus what they can review if it's a voluntary disclosure. And so from a First Amendment perspective, the government can require speech if it's necessary to prevent the labeling from being misleading. And so there's been a lot of case law in different spaces, but what it's come down to is that can't be just based on consumer interest alone. So if there's something that a consumer wants to know, might be interested in knowing, but it's not necessary for the consumer to know to understand the nature of the product and what it provides and what it contains, then the government can't compel that information. And so the biggest example in the FDA space has been FDA has long refused to require that GMO claims be included on products that are produced using bioengineering, because FDA has said, even though a consumer might want to know that information, we don't have the authority to require that information because it's not resulting in a material difference in the ultimate product. There's nothing about that product that the consumer needs to know. And so that's kind of a percolating bigger picture question here of ultimately, there might be a need to require a disclosure or qualifying language of some type to ensure that people know what they're buying. And I think from a marketing perspective, that might be desired in any event. But in terms of compelling speech of requiring additional information, there's an interesting First Amendment analysis there. And there's a lot of good First Amendment history and case law that kind of limits what the government can actually require. And so what Brian's touching on, I think, kind of on that final point is there are voluntary claims. And if there are voluntary claims, the government can define those to help make sure that they're being used in the right way. But then there's also the question of what might be mandatory. And that gets into kind of these state examples. And I don't want to focus on these too much today because I want to give you guys some time for questions, and also because I think from a cultured meat perspective, particularly those products that are ultimately regulated by USDA, state laws will likely be preempted. And so whatever system USDA puts in place, that will inform what has to happen in states as well. And so a lot of these state laws that we've seen percolating over the past few years, I think will not be relevant. And quite frankly, I'm not sure why there's been such a push to pass these state laws when products aren't on the market yet and their labels will need to be approved by USDA, but that's maybe a separate discussion. But we did want to give a few examples just to show kind of the scope of it. And so Missouri was the first state that passed a law. They did that a few years ago. They've been sued. They successfully defended the lawsuit, but they also issued guidance effectively saying that you can't represent a product as meat if it's not from slaughtered animal, but if you use qualifying language, that's likely not kind of a misrepresentation. And so they did soften the language of that requirement a bit. Louisiana had a much broader law, and so that went all the way to rice and sugar and other products that are being made from kind of alternative sources. They too have been sued, and there's kind of ongoing litigation there, but we haven't seen enforcement at that level. A number of other states have passed laws that just expressly allow qualifying language, and so if they do, those laws have been less concerning, I think, from kind of a labeling perspective broadly. And then there's a number of states where it's been very actively percolating. And so Texas this past year had, I think, 7 different laws introduced. I had the opportunity to testify there twice earlier this year, and just it's very interesting to see kind of what arguments are being advanced and what arguments are being made about what should be required in the labeling. And so I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think the general message is for products that are regulated by USDA, the hope is that preemption will apply. I think for FDA regulated products, there's a bit more of a question there just because FDA doesn't have that same pre-market authority. And we just wanted to flag a few global developments. Our goal here was to focus on the US, of course, but just to kind of put these out here, that this certainly is a broadly global issue. Of course, we had the news in Singapore last December authorizing the marketing of a product for human consumption. We've seen a lot of thinking and developments in China and Japan about these issues as well and how to approach them. And in the EU, I think the framework there is a bit more challenging just because of the novel food structure, but we are seeing some development there too in terms of kind of how to approach and how to work with regulators.
Yeah, so to round out the conversation, labeling is obviously really important to consumer perception. If we think about GMOs from dating back to the early 1990s when FDA released a policy statement on GM crops, and the fact that FDA did not require any kind of specific disclosure back then for many, many years regarding GMOs. And then more recently, consumers have been demanding to know more about the production methods behind their, how their foods are made. And so even though there's no safety difference between a GM fruit and a non-GM fruit, consumers now have the right to know based on a law that takes effect, or the compliance date. It's coming up on January 1st, 2022. That's called the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard. It is in this context that we're considering the labeling conversation for cultured meat. And so it'll be interesting to see how the labeling conversation evolves, the different state laws that are coming about, even if they do not directly impact cultured meat. The principles that are being espoused there could impact the discussions at the federal level, the types of comments that we see submitted in response to USDA's requests for comments. And so we're keeping a close eye on all of that. And I think one thing that the industry is definitely aware of and doesn't want to occur here is captured by this Forbes headline here: cultured meat could suffer the same fate as GMOs. And that's just meaning that like people were a bit kind of scared of GMOs like in the public discourse. And we want to make sure that the labeling that is chosen for the products here in this category are easily understood by consumers. They understand what they're getting, and that FDA is satisfied from a regulatory standpoint, and that consumers also feel that they have total understanding of what they're consuming. So looking ahead, I think we can look for further clarification from the FDA and USDA on the regulatory framework affecting cell-cultured meat. We're definitely going to see some new rules on labeling for cell-cultured meat. The timeline is not yet set in stone, but the process has kicked off, and so we can look for some developments in the next 1 to 2 years or so. We'll probably see something from FDA on labeling. It's not clear that they would be undertaking rulemaking, but there could be guidance and the like, so we're going to keep a close eye on that. And for sure, there will be continued political interest at both the federal and state level. We saw the Real Meat Act of 2019. I'm sure we'll see similar kinds of legislation going forward, and we'll keep a close eye on it. And of course, litigation along the lines of what Jessica was explaining to us. We just had a couple articles that we wanted to bring your attention to that we've authored or co-authored in the recent past that would be good reference if you're interested in learning more about the regulatory landscape. With that, I think we're happy to take.
Yeah, we have just a couple minutes, but Brian and I will both be around the rest of the day today and also tomorrow. And so if you have specific questions and want to chat with us, please do.
Great. If you do have questions, please use the mic in the corner there. We have room for 2 or 3 questions.
Sorry, 30 minutes is a short time.
I'm glad I got in quick while there was a chance. My name is Doug Grant. I host a podcast called Brave New Meat about the industry. I noticed on your slide when you were talking about when the Cattlemen's Association introduced their complaint about the nature of beef, and then it was, I think, 2.5 or 3 years before that was resolved. So thinking about all the things that you've seen in the Texas instances that you were talking about, that group or someone else may come up with something that we haven't even thought of in this room. Should we expect it'll be another 2.5, 3 years before FDA or USDA would be able to resolve that?
Well, I mean, I think what we'll see is we'll see USDA put out some framework, and we'll see FDA put out some framework. And to me, the question is, are all the stakeholders, including cattlemen and others, going to be okay with that? Or is it something where they're going to object? And if they're going to object, they could sue USDA, they could sue FDA, they could take action through Congress. And so it's hard to predict. I think some of it will be, though, just how happy, satisfied, entities are across the board in terms of what's ultimately required. So I will say 3 years is actually pretty quick for an agency to respond to a petition. That's not a great, but it often takes a long time. But I do think it's just some of it is what the framework is that ultimately comes about. I mean, at the state level, what we've seen is, even by cattlemen, some acceptance of qualifying language, and the use of qualifying language really critical is what that term is, where it needs to appear on the label, how prominent it needs to be, things like that. And so I think that's what it might come down to.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Alex Paul. I'm a local attorney here in the Bay Area, and I love your articles and guidance that you guys give out on this. My question is, if you had to bet, how do you think the labeling will come down So I'm curious what your personal opinions are, if you could look in your crystal ball. And related to that, do you think it's possible to ever require a label of slaughtered meat to distinguish for people where that might be important?
I don't mean, I like your idea. I don't mean to, but I just am imagining the opposition to that. I don't know. I mean, my guess is it's going to be that there's some qualifying term required. For me, it's hard to think of. I go back and forth as to whether regulators might think that standardizing that term, so saying you have to use this term, cultured or whatever it is, or nothing, is something that's better for consumers and more clear, or if they decide to allow flexibility. I mean, I think that's one question. My gut is that they would think, from consumer understanding perspective, kind of standardizing that term, and especially because USDA is so focused on standards of identity and across the board, might be easier. But that's really, I think, where I'm at this point. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think it's hard to say. I think a qualifier for sure will be required, but what that qualifier is, it's like to be determined, and USDA certainly doesn't know yet either. So
I think it's interesting to think about, if we start from the premise that meat is very broad and you have to describe how it's produced regardless, that's a very interesting premise and an argument I think that could be made to USDA.
Could it be the case that there's multiple qualifiers?
Like options to be used? I think there could. I think sometimes, from a regulator perspective, the question is what's needed to prevent deception, and is allowing flexibility in that kind of inviting potential confusion. I could see maybe a list, a couple different options, and those are the choices, something like that.
Okay, thanks.